Imagine this. You're a proud Briton in 43 CE, minding your own business, painting your face blue, and enjoying a nice bowl of whatever passes for cereal in ancient Britain. Then, out of nowhere, a bunch of guys in shiny sandals, speaking a language that sounds like someone gargling marbles, land on your shores and start waving swords. The Romans are here, and they're not exactly knocking politely. What do? Well, if you're a Briton, you have two options. Stand and fight like Boudica, we'll get to her later, or pack your bags, grab your sheep, and run like your life depends on it. Because, well, it does. This is the story of how the Britons, in a mix of panic, strategy, and sheer stubbornness, tried to outrun the greatest military force of the ancient world. Spoiler alert, it gets messy, and there's a lot of mud. When Emperor Claudius gave the green light to invade Britain in 43 CE, it wasn't a small expedition. It was a full-on real estate takeover. Led by Aulus Plautius, 4 legions, around 40,000 battle-hardened soldiers stormed across the Channel with one mission: make Britain Roman, whether the Britons liked it or not. Spoiler, they didn't. Now, to understand why the Britons freaked out, you need to imagine the Roman army like an ancient version of a high-tech alien invasion. The Britons, mostly tribal warriors who fought with passion and really cool war paint, had never seen anything like the Roman war machine. These guys had formations, engineers, and worst of all, bureaucracy. The Britons quickly realized that fighting a bunch of guys who built roads while invading was going to be a problem, and so began the Great British Retreater Masterclass in strategic running, led by various tribal leaders who had very different ideas on how to handle the whole Romans knocking at our door situation. Caractacus, one of the most famous Briton leaders, took a stand. He rallied his warriors and set up defenses. But here's the thing. Romans loved a good battle. But they really loved a battle where they could show off their superior tactics. They treated Briton resistance like a training exercise. Picture a bunch of Britons charging at the Roman lines, screaming, swinging swords, and just being all kinds of chaotic. Now picture the Romans rolling their eyes, raising their shields, and forming a nice, clean testudo, tortoise formation, before methodically cutting down anyone who got too close. It was like watching an over-enthusiastic puppy run straight into a brick wall, except, with more screaming. Realizing this wasn't working, the Britons did what any reasonable person would do in the face of overwhelming force. They ran. And so, a grand game of ancient hide-and-seek began. The Britons didn't just run in a straight line. That would be too easy. No, they made the Romans work for it. They retreated into the thick, muddy forests, using their knowledge of the terrain to lead the Romans into swampy death traps. Think of it like Home Alone. But instead of paint cans and marbles, it was quicksand and angry druids. The druids, by the way, were not thrilled about the Romans showing up. These guys were the spiritual and political leaders of Britain, and they were very much into things like human sacrifice and keeping Romans out of their business. Their HQ, the island of Mona, modern-day Anglesey, which basically became the Britons' last-ditch hideout when things got really bad. By 60 CE, things took a turn for the really dramatic. Enter Boudica, the queen of the Iceni tribe, who had just about had it with the Romans. After they disrespected her family in the worst way possible, she went full action movie protagonist. She led a rebellion that actually made the Romans sweat for a minute, burning down Londinium, London, and leaving a trail of scorched earth behind her. But As you might have guessed, Rome didn't appreciate being embarrassed by a bunch of barbarians. They crushed Boudica's rebellion in a battle that was so one-sided it's painful to read about. The Britons fought bravely but were outmatched in every possible way. After that, resistance was mostly scattered, and the Romans started mopping up the remaining holdouts. By the time they got to Mona in 84 CE, they were done with British resistance. They stormed the island, wiped out the last of the Druids, and made it clear Rome was here to stay. So what happened to the Britons who didn't feel like sticking around under Roman rule? 1. Some fled North Scotland, then known as Caledonia, was the last refuge for many who wanted nothing to do with Roman sandals stomping on their traditions. The Picts, Scotland's fierce tribes, became famous for keeping the Romans at bay, so much so that the Romans eventually built Hadrian's Wall to keep them out. 2. Some went to Ireland. Ireland was never conquered by Rome. Some Britons packed up their things and sailed off, possibly spreading their culture there. 3. Some just went off the grid. The Romans weren't everywhere. Some Britons just faded into the landscape, living in the more remote parts of the island and avoiding Roman rule as best they could. And just like that, the Britons' great game of cat and mouse came to an end. Rome had won well, kind of. The Britons never really accepted Roman rule, and even though they stuck around for a few centuries, when Rome eventually fell, Britain was one of the first places they lost control of. Here's the funny part. The Romans put all this effort into conquering Britain, and in the end, it didn't even stick. By 410 CE, Rome had bigger problems like being invaded by actual barbarians. They packed up and left, leaving Britain to fend for itself. And what happened to all those Britons who had spent decades running from the Romans? Well, their descendants ended up shaping British culture in ways the Romans never could have predicted. The Celts, the Picts, and the many other tribes that resisted would go on to influence medieval Britain, with their languages and traditions surviving long after Rome was just a memory. So in the end, the Britons may have lost the battles, but they kind of won the war. Rome left, but the Britons' legacy lived on. And if you really think about it, the biggest joke of all was on the Romans. They went through all that effort, only for Britain to shrug and move on without them. History is full of incredible stories of resilience, resistance, and strategic running. The Britons' flight from the Roman conquest is a reminder that sometimes survival is the real victory. If you enjoyed this wild tale of ancient Britain, don't forget to dig deeper. There's so much more to uncover. What do you think? Were the Britons tactical geniuses, or did they just get lucky? Drop your thoughts in the comments, and let's keep the history and humor alive.